also turns out, and perhaps this is again not a surprise to many of us in this room, while we can talk about an incredible spread of technology, it is by no means ubiquitous. This is, of course, also I should mention, not a photoshopped sign. This is in fact a sign outside of a town I spend my time in South Australia. This is outside of Morgan in the Riverland in South Australia. This sign does suggest the internet might still be a destination, and one you could choose not to go to, which is interesting. And even as we talk about a world in Australia of a national broadband network, even as we talk about the spread of 3G and 4G technology globally, it is simply the case that not everyone is connected to high-speed, true two-way broadband, fast download, fast upload. We're still talking about a very uneven distribution of technology, and it will stay that way. And indeed, it's safe in some ways to argue that the future of the digital divide may be less about whether the technology is present and more about whether it is robust, whether it is accessible, and what the price scale is for how you access it. And we know that what we're going to see is a patchwork of technologies, both fixed-line broadband as well as various forms of mobile broadband. We know that in many places in the world, most of the African subcontinent, for instance, the first place people are encountering broadband is actually encountering the internet, is actually on mobile phones and in cyber cafes. And that results in a very different set of experiences than what it might mean to be encountering it on your own personal device. So we start to think about the world that we broadcast into, the world that we develop technology for. It's not one where everyone is going to have the same forms of connectivity and the same set of devices. What we do know, however, and I think this is very different than the landscape that I entered nearly a decade ago, is that we're no longer talking about device convergence. I think some of us who work in the tech field imagined there was going to be this kind of Tolkienian fantasy of one device to rule them all. Everyone's going to have their one device and they're going to abandon everything else. And every time a new device came out, we'd have the conversation of, is this the killer device, and everyone's going to abandon everything else? The reality seems to be both in the West, in mature economic markets and emerging economic markets, consumers seem to be opting for an ensemble approach to devices. They have many rather than one. What that ensemble looks like varies by country, by economic status, by availability, but we rarely now find a consumer who has a single device. This is a young man we visited recently in the UK. There are 15 discrete objects in this room that he uses in any given day. Now, he's probably on the leading edge of a lot of stuff because there's no way you could put all of that in a backpack. But the notion that people are going down to one device seems not to be the case. Most consumers, most citizens, most audiences have multiple devices. They have smartphones, they have laptops, they may have PCs, they have televisions, they have radios, they have GPS devices, they have digital cameras. Sometimes they have one device that does many of those things. Sometimes they have many devices and they use them to just do one thing each. Furthermore, most consumers don't own devices just by themselves. Those devices exist within social networks. So while it may not be the case in the Australian market, it's certainly the case in a number of other markets represented in this room that consumers share devices in families. So the mobile phone is owned by multiple people, a laptop is used by multiple people, an email account is used by multiple people. All of those start to suggest a much more complicated landscape than we have historically in some ways designed for. And the reality is it's not getting less, it's getting more. I think this notion, for me, of device density, of how many devices are people willing to own, we've not yet hit the top ceiling of what that looks like. I think there are some things that gate it. I think there is a rule about how heavy your backpack or your handbag will be before you give up in frustration and start dumping stuff. And there are clearly physical gates in people's houses about how much electricity there is, where the power points are, the electrical outlets. And truthfully, one of the biggest fights I've ever seen in people's homes around the world, other than the fight about who controls the remote control, is the fight about who gets the electrical outlet next to the sofa, on the kitchen counter next to the bed. Because those are finite resources. So as we think about this sort of spread of technology, there are things that in some ways gate its spread and distribution.